Chapter 15 Regenerating Faith. Listeners will pardon if we make a relevant digression in this chapter from the main stream of our narration, just to indicate in brief the historical significance of the new church that was founded by the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna Abhedananda. Some might hesitate to call the Ramakrishna Movement a church in the usual sense of the term, for it has all along avoided the mistake of trying to create a cult or tradition of itself. Truly so, but if we look at the movement strictly from historical perspective, it would not be derogatory to call it a church in the wider and deeper sense of the term. Every prophet leaves behind him both a tradition and a church, and the history of religions of the world spread over centuries bears ample testimony to it. The Ramakrishna Monastery, which came into being towards the closing years of the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, and which in years to follow gathered momentum, was the new church of a regenerating faith, which the world needed at that time. How this faith, in its turn, has generated a new type of spiritual fervor amongst the people, not only in India, but also in the West, is too portent of fact to be retold. The sole aim of human life is to attain God, and human relationship is best expressed in terms of service as worship. This is exactly what we mean by the term regenerating faith, which this new church proclaims, and this is what the founders and the followers of this church have all along sought to preach. Did any faith or doctrine in any age and anywhere in the world proclaim that God realization can be actually proved by direct experience, or that all religions are true, that each man has to approach God in its own way, and finally that men and women are essentially divine? Let us therefore examine to what extent this regenerating faith could be called as a sort of divine dispensation, born out of historical urge and utterly fulfilled in the sadhana of Sri Ramakrishna and his disciples. The multiplicity of churches and creeds one beholds in the world is quite perplexing and embarrassing. Each church gives its peculiar solution to the problem of human salvation. Each has its own theory of redeeming and regenerating faith. From such a heterogeneous mass of conflicting theories, it is difficult to evolve anything like order or unity. In discussing the subject, it is therefore safe to avoid altogether controversial questions of polemical theology, and try to proceed upon those general and admitted principles of belief which constitutes the essence of universal and absolute religion, and challenge the assent of every unprejudicial mind. And from these simple and Catholic principles only could be educed what appears to be the right idea of regenerating faith. However obvious and simple the fundamental truth, speculative and practical theism may be, and however supported they may be by common consent, a small amount of reflection will suffice to show that there are some very important points of disagreement amongst those who prefer to believe in them. The fact is, even in regard to Catholic and essential truths, religion, as it prevails in the world, admits of a twofold classification, and each system presents peculiar features which clearly distinguish it from the other. The material distinction which exists between those two systems of religion deserves our careful attention. In both these systems, we find the same fundamental ideas and truths of religion. Both recognize the one God, acknowledge his infinite power and wisdom, love and holiness. Both admit the moral accountability of man and the existence of a future state of rewards and punishments. Both denounce sin and afford incentives to virtue and righteousness. Yet there is a vast and almost impassable gulf between them. Both spring up originally from the same root, but soon branch off in different and opposite directions. Both of the same parentage, they vary in the course of their development according to the influence they respectively receive. They are one in their main principles. Out in the subsequent and final issues of these principles, there is great divergence. So much so that it might be justified in calling the one the religion of the world and the other the religion of heaven. The one man-made and the other God-made religion. It is no doubt the interest of the world, and hence his constant endeavor, to confound and identify these two systems with each other, and deny the distinction which subsists between them. It is its interest to ignore heavenly religion and pass off that as God's truth, which is mainly its own fabrication. And this it seeks to do both by degrading what is heavenly and exalting as divine what is of the earth. This pious fraud requires to be shown up in its true colors and its evil effect exposed, that it may be universally proscribed and execrated. It is awful to contemplate the gravity and magnitude of the deception itself, and the amount of worldliness and demoralization and moral poverty it has been the means of producing in the religious world. Now, what is the distinction between the religion of the world and the saving religion of God? In the religion of the world, man is his own guide, and to a great extent his own savior. He depends upon his own faculties and powers for the attainment of truth and for deliverance from sin. Its prayer is that man's will may be done on earth in the name of God, whereas the prayer of Heaven's Creed is that God's will may be done on earth as it is in heaven. In the one, religion is subordinated to man's judgment and wishes, and from the decrees of providence there is always an appeal to human prudence for final decision. In the other, God's will is absolute and immutable law, and his judgment is final and irreversible, as Sri Ramakrishna very often used to say to his devotees and disciples. In the one, we see a stereotyped code of moral duties to be performed on the authority of conscience, the vice-regent of God in the human mind. But in every case, it is the interpretation arbitrarily put upon the code by prudence and expediency which actually rule the heart. In the other, whatever is right must be done, whether expedient or otherwise. The heart offers unquestioning submission to the divine commands, however hostile they may appear in their temporal interest, and instead of audaciously endeavoring to accommodate God's moral economy to its carnal requisitions, it seeks humbly to exalt and adapt itself to the requirements of God's law. The religion of the world may also be characterized as the Old Testament creed. It suits man and meets his requirements in the earlier stages of his religious life. It serves him as an efficient guide in the discharge of the manifold duties which he owes to himself and to God. It is an imitative school, an imitation of moral discipline, where the infinite soul is trained to habits of honesty and virtue. But as the soul grows up, in the individual and in the nation, deeper wants are discovered and felt. An expanding experience points to the necessity of a higher and nobler kind of faith, and hence the necessity of the New Testament religion for the salvation of man. Nothing short of regenerating faith can satisfy the normal necessities of modern man. Ordinary faith leads but to the material achievement, not the achievement to the faith. It is one thing to argue that a recovery of faith in God is necessary for higher spiritual life. It is quite another to put forward sociological and historical facts as the basis for a revival of faith. Faith is not a matter of convenience, nor even a matter of sociology. It is a question of conviction and dedication, and both spring from one source, only from the belief in God as a fact, as the supreme fact of existence. This is the great inheritance we have from the ancient spiritual teachers of India. And again, this is the inheritance from the great saint of Dakshineswar, who ushered in a new life, a life of divine holiness, which the world's religion cannot give. This finds an echo in one of his lectures, which Swami Abhedananda once gave before an intellectual audience of the New World, and wherein he is reported to have said, "Let us then alienate our hearts from the religion of the world, to which we are all the more or less attached, and trustfully rely upon the religion of God, which alone can give us new life, new light, and peace." What is this new life as distinguished from the life which men ordinarily lead, and how is it to be attained? Obviously, this can be attained when there is a clear turning point in our career. This turning point is faith. Once brought to this point, the heart of man undergoes a marvelous change, not a superficial change in his outward pursuits of habits of thought and feeling, but a constitutional and organic change in the root of his very being. Now, let us proceed to consider what faith is. It has been very appropriately defined to be the evidence of things not seen and the substance of things hoped for. What the eye is to things visible, what reason is to things demonstrable, that is faith to the invisible realities of the spirit world. Faith, according to an ancient Indian philosopher, is the eye of the soul, whereby it sees spiritual realities directly and vividly. Nothing, indeed, is so common as to hear men talk of their faith in God, as if it meant the mere rudiments of religious knowledge, which all who profess to believe in His existence are sure to possess. Such faith, however, would appear to be nothing but an intellectual cognition, which is the result of reasoning and which rests on arguments. Such kind of faith is possessed more or less by all those who are not thorough atheists. But very few have faith in God in the true sense of the term, namely as spiritual perception. Such faith stands on the foundation of divine reality. The modern world learned from the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, who was an apostle of regenerating faith, and then through the agency of Swami Vivekananda and Swami Abhedananda, that God is the source, reason, and foundation of all things, the being which alone makes the idea of existence itself conceivable. This foundation can also be known under the form of the various attributes, goodness, truth, beauty, which are inexplicable in terms of ordinary material experiences. The fullness, the plenitude of the good, the true, and the beautiful are in God. Moreover, this order of reality, which is supreme and transcendent, and the foundation of everything else, is also immanent. The kingdom of heaven is within you. In the depth of our being, at the point of our soul, we are united with the source of reality. In the words of the German mystic Eckhart, writing in the high Middle Ages, "To gauge the soul, we must gauge it with God, for the ground of God and the ground of the soul are one and the same." The firmest proof of religion is rooted in the nature of reality, in the necessities of reason, in the undeviant character of such concepts as truth and goodness. Since, however, the Western mind has in the last century become more and more accustomed to think of proof in the pragmatic terms of modern science, a thing being true if it can be shown to work. It is perhaps worth remembering that even here in the sphere of pragmatic proof, faith and science conform to a similar pattern and claim a comparable validity. The world which science lays bare in its capacity as weigher and measurer is one soundless, colorless impulses of energy, which under given conditions appear to behave in certain ways. Science can predict up to a point how, under given conditions, this queer universe of energy will behave. Where the claim of science is to lay bare the reality of facts, it is there that religion can help us, for it proceeds with a greater degree of certitude than science. The saint can say, "This universe I tell you of, in which God's being and energy and love feel all reality, and in which the base of your own soul is anchored in the source of being, may seem to you very far removed from the colorful material reality which you meet every day." Science proceeds through experiments to arrive at a certain result. It is nonetheless true of religion, for the experiments of a religious life work in exactly the same way. Here the raw materials consist in all too human the mind and body, which need processing through the laboratory of detachment, humility, prayer, and love. And the result will be the explosion into our life of the overwhelming love and knowledge of God. In our time, we have witnessed in the sanctuary of Dakshineswar such an experiment conducted by one who has shown us the path to regenerating faith. If science is known by results, and this is in fact where its certitude rests, so also are the truths of religion. The experimental tests of religion are more delicate and unstable than those of science. For the raw material, the heart of man, has not that implicit obedience to the law of its own nature, which is observable in metals or minerals or even living tissues. Inconveniently but gloriously, it has a free and unconditioned element. Again and again in the laboratory itself, the experiment is botched. Yet where is it triumphantly concluded in a Buddha, in a Saint Francis of Assisi, or in a Ramakrishna? The experimental proof of religion shines forth with a light no less clear than that of science. Speaking of Sri Ramakrishna, the greatest spiritual experimenter the world has ever seen, no one can doubt the splendor and purity of the summits of his thought, nor question the value of its universal spirit, from which emanates the white radiance of regenerating faith. In the light of man's spiritual history, it can be said with emphasis, and of course without any fear of contradiction, that those who seek shall find, to those who ask shall be given, and those who knock shall have reopened to them the doors of creation, freedom, and spiritual life. While the Western mind accepts the idea that intellectual truth is the highest verity, the Indian religious thinker knows that all the highest eternal verities are truths of the spirit. The supreme truth is neither the rigid conclusion of logical reasoning nor the affirmation of creedal statement, but fruits of the soul's inner experience. Intellectual truth is only one of the doors to the outer precincts of the temple, and it hardly admits the mind to some faint ray from a supreme light. One is reminded in this connection of the beautiful words once expressed by Sri Ramakrishna. There are no true and false religions, but rather all religions are true in their own way and degree. Each is one of the thousand paths to the one eternal. This gives us a clue to the core of Indian religious thought, which place four necessities before human life. First, It imposed upon the mind a belief in the highest consciousness or state of existence, universal and transcendent of the universe, from which all comes, in which all lives and moves without knowing it, and of which all must one day grow aware, returning towards that which is perfect, eternal, and infinite. Next, it laid upon the individual life the need of self-preparation by development and experience till man is ready for an effort to grow consciously into the truth of his greater existence. Thirdly, it provided it with a well-founded, well-explored, many-branching and always enlarging way of knowledge and of spiritual or religious discipline. And lastly, for those not yet ready for these higher steps, it provided an organization of the individual and collective life, a framework of personal and social discipline and conduct, of mental and moral and vital development, by which they could move each in his own limits and according to his own nature, in such a way as to become eventually ready for the greater existence. The first three of these elements are the most essential to any religion, but Hinduism has always attached to the last also a great importance. It has left out no part of life as a thing secular and foreign to the religious and spiritual life. Still, the Indian religious tradition is not merely the form of a religio-social system, as the Western people imagine. The fundamental idea of all Indian religions is one common to the highest human thinking everywhere. The supreme truth of all that it is, a being or an existence beyond the mental and physical appearance that we contact here. Beyond mind, life, and body, there is a spirit and self, Atman, containing all that is finite and infinite, surpassing all that is relative, a supreme absolute, originating and supporting all that is transient, one eternal, one transcendent, universal, original, and sempiternal divinity, or divine essence and consciousness. Soul, nature, life are only a manifestation or partial phenomenon of this self-aware eternity and this conscious eternal. But this truth of being was not seized by the Indian mind only as a philosophical speculation, a theological dogma, an abstraction contemplated by the intelligence. It was not an idea to be indulged by the thinker in his study, but otherwise void of practical learning on life. It was not a mystic sublimation which could be ignored in the dealings of man with the world and nature. It was a living spiritual truth, a power, a presence that could be sought by all according to their degree of capacity and seized in 1,000 ways through life and beyond life. This truth was to be lived and even to be made the governing idea of thought, life, and action. This recognition and pursuit of something or someone supreme behind all forms is the one universal credo of Indian religion, which is eternally alive from the days of the Upanishads down to the age of Dakshineswar, where the experiment conducted by a semi-literate saint proved that the infinite alone justifies the existence of the finite, and the finite by itself has no entirely separate value or independent existence. Life is no illusion. It is a divine play, a manifestation of the glory of the Divine Mother, who is but the concrete aspect of the infinite. These words of Sri Ramakrishna in the modern age of science and skepticism at once point to the fact that self-realization and God-realization are the great business of the living and thinking human being, and that all life and thought are in the end a means of progress towards self-realization and God realization. The advent of this apostle of God realization has established beyond any shadow of doubt that the discovery of the inner spiritual self in man, the divine soul in him, and some said of living in uniting contact or absolute unity of the soul in man with God or supreme self, the eternal Brahman, is the condition of spiritual perfection, which means seeing the one self and Godhead in all. This is the highest spiritual truth that was proclaimed from the hermitage of Dakshineswar and later on translated into action at the monastery at Baranagar, from where came out the mighty current of regenerating faith, such as we have seldom seen. Let us now proceed to inquire what is the exact nature of the state of regenerative existence into which faith leads us. What are the characteristics and criteria of regeneration? Regeneration means the elevation of our body, mind, and soul. If the task of religion and spirituality is to meditate between God and man, between the eternal and infinite, the task of regenerating faith is much more important, for it brings home the greatness and uplifting power of the spiritual consciousness to the everyday life of man. Regeneration means the death of the individual ego and the establishment in its place of a complete spiritual life in God. It involves two facts, one negative and the other positive, and is capable of two corresponding tests. In order that a man may be regenerated, he must destroy his individual ego and also his carnal nature. He must be dead to the senses, to the little self, and to the world. Mere abstinence from corrupt indulgences will not do. There must be an entire annihilation of the sensual, the selfish, and the world cravings and propensities of the heart. To make the matter clear, the regenerated man is unto the world and its temptations are altogether dead. Place before him all the treasures of the world, and they do not excite his avarice. Ply his senses with the most exciting and enticing objects of sensual delight, and his senses cannot even feel their influence. Offer him all manner of selfish enjoyments, and these have no power over him, for all his senses and carnal affections and self-love are dead. And he is as impervious to temptation as a dead body. Has not the world found in the life of Sri Ramakrishna the utter truth of this? Did he not say that so long as the individual soul has the slightest attachment to the world of senses and desires, it cannot attain to supreme knowledge? But there is also a positive side of the process of regeneration. The soul is not only to be dead to the world, but alive unto God and truth. It must not only retire from the world, but enter into the kingdom of heaven. The sadhana that began at Dakshineswar thus found its fulfillment not in any sort of negative asceticism or self-mortification, which Sri Ramakrishna never considered as the end of human existence. According to him, he is a true ascetic or a regenerated man in whom spirit rises above the body and who desires nothing but the development of spiritual life and is inseparable in the normal development of the soul. They are only two sides, as it were, of the same spiritual fact. The realization of this fact in its entirety and fullness in our lives constitutes real regeneration and is the true criterion by which it is to be tested. To live in God and in nothing else is what the regenerating faith has to offer us. But what is it to live in God? Look at the phenomenal life of the saint of Dakshineswar, and you will understand it properly. Did he not teach us to apply to the soul in its relation to the Divine Mother or God all our ideas of bodily life in relation to the world? If it is true that the body is governed and preserved mainly by instincts, it is equally true that man's spiritual nature is to the same manner governed and preserved by spiritual instincts. When the soul rejoices in God, it is then and then only that it appears to be wholly regenerated. To live day and night in holy and sweet divine communion is the highest aim of spiritual life and regenerating faith. Hence it is that Sri Ramakrishna, whose mission was to regenerate mankind consistently and insistently, urged upon his followers absolute surrender of the soul to God in thought, word, and action. In his religion, there is no looking back after holding the plow, no partial reformation, but a putting on the divine life, a perpetual pressing forward towards the perfection of the divine nature. He did not seek to make men virtuous and honest in the world, but to bring them out of the bondage of the world and make them live in the blessedness of the holy spiritual life in the kingdom of God. Ramakrishna taught mankind how to think of the Spirit and how to live in God consciousness, to convince the skeptics of the present age that Atman, the true self, is divine, that God consciousness is as true and practical as scientific experiment in a laboratory, that one reaches perfection, freedom from all bondage is attained. It was not from any dead book of philosophy that he learnt all this, but directly from the Divine Mother, and hence he is regarded as a living example of regenerating faith, which leads all seekers of truth to the path of perfection. And when, in the course of history, time came for spiritual regeneration of the world, it fell to the lot of India to proclaim her message through the agency of two of her greatest modern preachers, Swami Vivekananda and Swami Abhedananda. As one carefully studies their lives, one sees that both of them were capable exponents of this regenerating faith based on the lofty doctrines of Vedanta, which enkindled millions of hearts in the world. Thus, it was not just a monastery in the usual sense of the term that came into being at Varanakar, but historically speaking, it indicated the birth of a future church from the pulpit of which was proclaimed to the world at large the golden message of regenerating faith. And if we look beneath the surface of the whole Ramakrishna movement that started during the closing years of the late 1800s and which continues still today, we cannot fail to see the wise and beneficent arrangements of divine economy for the uplift of humanity at large.